I heard the murmur and the murmuring sound, in that sweet mood when pleasure loves to pay tribute to ease, and of its joys secure. The heart luxuriates with indifferent things, wasting its kindliness on stocks and stones, and on the vacant air. I started reading poetry this year. It's kind of a new thing for me. I've been a reader at different points in my life, but never poetry. I think that rhymed poetry has always felt a little immature, and unrhymed poetry has felt arbitrary. I've always seen the additional structure imposed by poetry as a barrier that hinders communication rather than enhances it. Looking back, I just didn't understand the art form. And so before I talk about the poetry I read last year, I have to talk about the book that changed my mind. I wish I had a copy on me, then I could reference specific passages and make my stack look bigger. But it was the library book. I was just wandering the shelves and the title caught my eye. The Architecture of Poetry by Brad Lighthouser. I studied architecture in school, and it didn't help my engagement with poetry. The current, orthodoxy of architecture is that everything has to be rational. We're taught in school that any choice you make, you have to have reasons for it that are not aesthetic, that are related in some way to function or use. I've always thought that poetry was decorated text, that the additional structure imposed was in a way aesthetic and didn't contribute to meaning. Who would have thought reading a book on the history of an art form helps you understand what you might see as eccentricities? This book taught me that the various forms of the English language are just kind of built into the language, whether it is by the length of our words or the length of our thoughts or the amount of breath we use when speaking a sentence. All of this has been factored into the development of English poetry. And one of the ways you can see this is looking at other languages. They come up with different poetic forms, and their optimal meters are different. Rhyme in particular has an interesting history. English poetry didn't always rhyme. It used to be alliterative. Rhyme was brought into English from French and Latin literature, and the man largely responsible for bringing it in, or at the forefront of that movement, Geoffrey Chaucer, complained that English was rhyme poor. One of the sections I remember best from Brad's book is when he's talking about how French poetry can rhyme differently. They can do different things with their endings that we just can't do in English. And Chaucer actually could do things that we couldn't do. In the Middle English dialect that he's speaking, you would pronounce the E at the end of a lot of words. And what this lets him do is it lets him make a feminine rhyme, a rhyme on an unstressed syllable rather than on a stressed one. I think a rhyme on a stressed syllable, it pulls a lot of weight towards the end of the sentence. There are other poets who tried to soften their rhymes, using imperfect rhymes, or spacing them further apart, or playing with the length of the sentence. All in all, this book made me see the system of poetry, the secrets and the rules that make it make sense. It's possible that any book could have done it, but this is the one that did it for me. If I'm serious about reading English poetry, I have a lot of catching up to do. And is there a better place to start than with Geoffrey Chaucer? I don't have the book I read Chaucer from. That was also a library book, but he's also right here. Chaucer definitely isn't the beginning of English poetry, but he is the beginning of a certain kind of tradition within English poetry. And to a degree, it's the tradition that continues from Chaucer all the way up until today. What's special about reading him, though, is seeing that form birthed at full strength. Chaucer is a master of the type of poetry that he himself is laying the foundations for. Personally, I liked his romances, The Knight's Tale and the fragment of The Squire's Tale. It's almost as if while kicking off English poetry, Chaucer is also kicking off its love affair with the Middle Ages. Chaucer, of course, writing from within the Middle Ages, but within 200 years after him, you'll have Edmund Spenser, who is looking back at Chaucer and idolizing what he sees as a purity of language and imagery, a purity that he thought was being lost in his age. And this line of thought doesn't end with Spenser. He passes it on way down through the history of English poetry, to the sentimentalists, to Gothic literature, to the Romantics, to the Pre-Raphaelites, and even all the way until now. You could say that this lays the foundation for our modern fantasy writing and all of its reliance on the iconography of the Middle Ages. The Odyssey and the Iliad. I read both this year, both in the Richmond Lattimore translation. Writing some notes on my experience, I already start to feel the anxiety to read these things again. I think I would need maybe 5 more reads before I could write anything really satisfying. I read the Iliad first, a work of incredible force. I'm not the first person to say that. I think that the most brutal descriptions in this poem could rival the most brutal things you could write today. Burned into the back of my mind by text is the image of a hero falling to the ground, struck by a spear in the back of the head, gripping its point between his teeth as he falls to the dirt. Most of the poem really is waves on waves of violence, but within the endlessness, the poem reveals something of its philosophy. Heroes rise and fall, page by page, achieving their glory and then dying for the glory of another. The gods rage above while the battle rages below. Their petty squabbles, their favoritism translate directly into the glory and the death of man. We feel the pressure of fate throughout the poem, knowing that Hector will die, and knowing that Achilles will die, even if we don't see it in the poem. Among the sides of the battle and the masses of men, there's a certain individualism that emerges. We witness and pay homage to certain heroes on either side of the battle. We watch their brief moments of glory, the rapid rise and the rapid fall. And that is all we can do within the relentless march of time and fate and the raging endless winds of the earth. I feel a supreme somber loneliness throughout that culminates in the haunting liminality of the last few books, where Hector's father pleads for his son and heroes wander about in the quiet respite of the night. And we know that there is more to come, but it's left for a different story. The Odyssey is very different. Despite the different heroes and their varying levels of greatness, the Iliad really makes you think about the struggles common to all mankind, our slow movement towards death, and the feeling of helplessness as we are pushed about by chance or fate or the gods. The Odyssey takes a very different approach. It props up Odysseus as a paragon, an ideal pattern of man, and it gives us the less developed Telemachus to put us in the place of a child looking up at Odysseus. Something that interested me a while ago when I was reading some of Sophocles' plays is that Odysseus wasn't always held up as the ideal man in Greek culture. There are different eras where Odysseus is seen more like a wicked trickster, like a Loki figure, who's getting his way deviously by the use of his wit, while there are more masculine, dignified heroes like Ajax or Hercules, who get their way with fighting skill. But here, Odysseus is the hero. He is the great man. And he's kind of in the place of our envy. We wish we were him, while he is listening to the siren's song, while he is outwitting Polyphemus, when he is the subject of desire for goddesses and nymphs, or the favorite of the goddess of wisdom. But then at the end of the story, he comes home. And there he really is like a father. He is like the father that you look up to for their strength, or their intelligence, or their good stories. And as you grow older, you realize that the heroic act was really being there for their family. You realize that the man is blessed whose pride is not in his accomplishments or in his abilities, but in his wife and children. I'll be reading these again. If you've tried to read them before and couldn't get into it, I recommend you look for a translation you like. Of the modern scholarly translations, I liked Lattimore's a lot, But the next time I read them, I think I'll be looking at like 19th century blank verse. There are prose translations, if that's more up your alley. There's a lot of options, and in my opinion, there isn't a right one. Whatever gets you reading the story is great. The Song of Roland, a medieval epic. It's really interesting reading the Song of Roland next to the Iliad. You realize that the Song of Roland is a lot more repetitive. It's more archetypal and less complex in its plot, and it's more limited in its imagery. Next to the Iliad's spear through the mouth and all of the blood mist, Roland's signature move is cutting a guy in half from the tip of his helmet all the way through his horse in one swing. It's cool. It's very exaggerated. It happens a lot. It makes you appreciate what you might call nuance in the Iliad's violence. All of that said, I liked the Song of Roland. I liked it a lot. It opened my eyes to a different kind of poetic form. The intense repetition is so present that it becomes the defining feature of the poetry. The poem lets a lot of things be standardized and averaged to become the backdrop for its two main heroes, for Roland and Oliver, and their emotional beats really become the peaks of the story that the rest builds up to in waves. I started writing while I was reading this poem, and you can kind of tell the repetitive sentence of the Song of Roland started to make its way into my work. It just put me in a different state of mind. I think the poem is really good to acquaint you with a different vision of what poetry can look like, especially because it comes through so well in translation. You really get a sense of what they were trying to do with the repetition. But honestly, the real reason to read it is it's very anime. The horseback breaking, the two dudes killing hundreds, the friendship, the betrayal. It's a lot of fun. Romantic poetry. Before I got into poetry, I was into art, painting, and a little bit of that was reading different theories about beauty and the way art works. I've always been attracted to the romantic vision of creativity, of our relationship to nature. The pre-Raphaelites, who were something of a late romantic group, they had a foot in both camps, in painting and in poetry. I also got a book on them from the library, but we won't talk about that one. Christina Rossetti. I did not read this whole thing. I read The Goblin Market and Other Poems, which is her first published book, and it contains what is by far her most important poem, The Goblin Market. Christina Rossetti's work isn't expressing a theory. She makes these pure poetic objects. You can try reading Rossetti's poem and pulling out theories and thoughts and beliefs that you see in it, but you'll end up short of the actual poetic object. In this, she surpasses some of the other pre-Raphaelites, because her work isn't just medievalist, it's not just romanticizing folk poetry. In her best work, you can feel this psychological depth running underneath the poem, and all of its symbols and its imagery, even if those symbols and imagery are taken from the simplest children's stories. It puts you in contact with her, with yourself, with the poem in a way that's kind of inexplicable. Her best poem, The Goblin Market, doesn't have a complex plot. Two girls encounter goblins. One of them eats some cursed fruit, and the other has to save her sister. It's not complicated. At least you don't expect it to be. But it generates meaning, a signification that is far beyond the sum of its parts. And that feeling has really become my standard for poetry. What poetry should be doing is communicating meaning at a deeper register, talking to the emotions or the imagination, rather than the intellect or the conscious mind. I find this feeling in my favorite work of a lot of the other romantic poets. For a primer, I started with this English romantic poetry anthology. Simon D. really wanted to make sure you knew this was his. It has William Blake, William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and then the triptych of Byron, Keats, and Shelley. I've read the first three. I haven't gotten to Byron, Shelley, and Keats yet because of how much William Blake has stolen my attention. This is my complete William Blake. I haven't read everything yet. I've read all of the published work except for the two final major prophecies, Milton and Jerusalem. Blake fits pretty well into the mold of poetry I just talked about. Sometimes you do get the sense that he is trying to teach his theology through his poetry, but there's other times when the function of poetry to enhance meaning is really active. Even in his earliest poetry, you can read his odes to the seasons, and it becomes pretty clear he's not talking about changes in the weather. Everything in Blake's poems really feels like a symbol of something more eternal. He sees a cosmic drama in the history of mankind and struggles to reveal it in his poetry, whether it's in the sweetest lyric poetry or in these raging prophecies that focus around his own unique pantheon of mythological figures. And finally, in his poetry is the grand call to save the world, to liberate mankind through creativity. He opens his poem, Milton, with a call to all artists. Would to God that all the Lord's people were prophets. I think I'll be reading Blake forever. I'll be talking about his work more, I'm sure. William Wordsworth. Wordsworth has been more difficult for me to get into. He doesn't have that same quality of Blake. When he's talking about nature, he often is actually talking about nature. It's not always the case. Sometimes he has to grasp at some bigger symbol. I think he does that a lot in the Prelude, which I haven't read, but you can just read him for the language. The more I read poetry, the more he gets better. He's a real master of the blank verse form, and he's very subtle and developed in the way he orchestrates sounds. One of the reasons he's also important is he helped push poetry towards using common everyday language, so he's very, very easy to read. Although in that, he makes it look much easier than it actually is what he's doing. Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Coleridge is great. I need to read more of him. His best works are absolutely poems of the imagination. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and the Fragment of Kubla Khan are intense visions of humanity, its aspects of extreme loneliness, lostness, and helplessness. He captures it in these symbolically rich images. Ambition fallen short, or a terrible crime and the path to repentance. He also writes regular nature poetry, and he was a big part in pushing Wordsworth towards some of the forms that he uses. But for some reason, Coleridge's version of this type of poem was easier for me to get into. I don't know if I could explain why, but there's something in The Secret Ministry of Frost that touched me quicker than Wordsworth's poetry in the same style. A couple things I started in 2025 and just didn't finish. I'm still reading Blake's work, of course. The real goal would be to read this cover to cover. It's not actually that much. If you look at it compared to other authors' complete works. In the name of catching up with the greats of the English language, I'm trying to read all of Shakespeare's plays, starting with the comedies and going chronologically by genre. I'm including these because most of his plays are in verse, and I'm reading for the poetry just as much as for the stories. Even in the less developed plays, he still does some wonderful things with the English language. The cadence, the blank verse, his sentence structure and order, and his sensitivity for finding beautiful and unexpected expressions. It's all there, even in the early plays. And then all of a sudden, you'll run into A Midsummer Night's Dream, and it's all so quickly on a different level. A collection of Thomas Hardy's poems. Actually, the first video on my channel, if it stays that way, is a video on Hardy. It's on my favorite poem from this volume. Hardy's a great writer, and his novels are incredible. There are whole chapters of those novels that I think you could read just for the language, like a prose poem. His poetry is a little more hit or miss for me. I'll finish the volume for sure, but after that, I think I'm more likely to read his novels than to look for more of his poetry. And that's all. Reading poetry is changing my life, slowly, poem by poem. It feels like bit by bit, I'm expanding my vision for beauty, my capacity for emotion. You should read poetry too. That's really all. That's what this is about. You can look at my other stuff if you're interested. More coming soon.